Hare Krishna. Please accept my humble obeisances. So we will now resume our discussion on the 18th chapter from verse 56. Sarvakarmanyaphi sada kurvano madvyapashrayah mat prasadadavapnoti shashvatam padam avyayam. Though engaged in all kinds of activities, my pure devotees under my protection reach the eternal and imperishable abode by my grace. So, in the previous section, from 41 to 55, Krishna had spoken about the various rungs of the yoga ladder, from Sakam to Nishkam Karma, from Nishkam Karma to the platform of Brahman realization, and then to the stage of Bhakti. But while speaking about Bhakti, he also made this point that one does not have to go through the successive stages of purification to reach it. Right? So he said Labade means that Bhakti manifests. Right? It is not nourished or developed, it manifests, considering the fact that it is the intrinsic quality of the jiva. So one may now object that uh, for those who are traversing up the yoga ladder, the process is long and laborious. They have to first control their senses for Sakam karma, they have to control their mind and their thoughts for Nishkam karma. They have to practice in that stage to develop Atmagyan. So it is a long process with lot of focus on sense control, mind control, repeated possibilities of fall down, and then they reach the platform of Brahmabhuta Prasannatma, Brahmabhuta from which they can execute devotional service. So, how is it that at the same time Krishna is saying that one can directly reach the stage of bhakti by passing this long, laborious, tedious, difficult ascension through yoga ladder? So, in this verse, he clarifies that. So, he says that mat vyapashraya, that because the devotees are under his protection, then mat prasadat, by his mercy, they achieve the shashvatam padam avyaya. They achieve the eternal abode of the Supreme Lord. So that is the key of the difference between the process of bhakti and the other processes of karma and gyan. Even though the mercy of Krishna is also there in karma and gyan, but because the practitioner does not approach Krishna directly, the mercy is also indirectly manifested in terms of their adherences to the instructions of Krishna. For a devotee, they are directly seeking the mercy of Krishna, and Krishna reciprocates by directly manifesting that mercy. So that is what gives the bhakti its potency. Let's go to the next verse. Verse 87. Chetasha sarva karmani mai sanyasya matparaha buddhi yogam upashritya matchita satatam bhava. In all activities, just depend upon me and work always under my protection. In such devotional service, be fully conscious of me. So, in the previous verse, Krishna had indicated that the devotee is able to directly reach the stage of bhakti because of his mercy. Now, one may say it's a bit of a catch 22 situation, that one only becomes a devotee by the mercy of Krishna, but on the other hand, to get the mercy of Krishna, one has to be a devotee. So, take the case of Arjun. that Arjun had this advantage that he was already present personally with Krishna. He was Krishna's cousin, he had some personal relationship with him, and that made him qualified to receive bhakti. But what about others who do not have that privilege, who do not have access to Krishna? So Krishna is pacifying and assuring them, saying that not just by being in my presence, but by experiencing my presence in many other ways. Right? So he gives instances over here. Yatitasya sarva karmani. That whatever you do it in Krishna consciousness. Mai sannyasah matparaha. That matparaha, this is a term that Krishna had first used in 261 also, when he had asked Arjun to depend upon him. So here again he says under my protection. Then Maya Sanyasa, giving up things for me. Buddhi Yogam Upashrita, that in this mood execute devotional service, Machchita Satatam Bhava, being fully conscious of me. So Krishna is present in his words. Krishna is present in his representatives. And Krishna is present in his deity form, in his name. So there are many ways in which Krishna makes himself accessible in the material world to even those who have not become qualified to be in Krishna's presence. So Krishna is saying that all these things are non different from me by following the instructions of my representative, by following the instructions that I give in the scriptures, by understanding those instructions and becoming conscious of me, dependent on me, it is as if you're already present on the mature platform of bhakti. Next verse. Verse 60. Swabhavajena kaunteya nibaddha svena karmana karutum nichhasi yanmohat karishyasi avashopiyat. Under illusion, you are now declining to act according to my direction. But compelled by the work born of your own nature, you will act all the same, O son of Kunti. So, this verse is an expansion of the previous verse. It reiterates the point that Arjun will be forced to act according to his propensity. Him being a Kshatriya, he will act according to his nature and fight. So, he has two options that under illusion, he will he will act according to the modes, or with enlightenment he will act under the instructions of Krishna. In both the cases the activity is the same, that Arjun is going to engage in warfare. The difference is the consciousness with which he will engage. Next verse, verse 61. Ishvara sarvabhutanam hridayashte Arjuna tishtati Brahman sarvabhutane yantratudhane mayaya. The Supreme Lord is situated in everyone's heart, O Arjun, and is directing the wandering of all living entities who are seated as on a machine made of the material energy. So Krishna is now introducing the notion of surrender to the Paramatma. Right? So uh, uh, Arjun or the Jiva might say that it is easy for me to surrender to the modes because they are so intricately linked to us. But how can we easily surrender to you? And Krishna says actually it is easier because along the Jiva is the Paramatma. And just like you think that the modes are controlling your action, actually the modes are passive. It is the Paramatma who is controlling your action. So then he might say, well, in that case, I'm already surrendered to the Paramatma. What's the problem? And Krishna says, no. For a jiva that is not surrendered to the Lord, the Paramatma is as if sitting on a machine. So the jiva and the Paramatma are both sitting on a machine, and they are manipulating the material energy. So another way of saying that Krishna is as Paramatma is playing a very passive role. But when the jiva surrenders, then the Paramatma actually becomes more active in directing the wanderings of the jiva. So this is also pointing to the ease of bhakti. That we may be intimately bound by the modes. We may have the modes with us since time immemorial, but we also have the Paramatma with us since time immemorial. And we may think that the modes are directing us, but even when the modes are directing us, it's the Paramatma that is directing us. The only difference is how does the Paramatma direct us? If you look at the modes, then the Paramatma is essentially a passive driver on a machine made of material energy. But if you become Krishna conscious, then the Paramatma becomes our friend, benefactor, and guide. So verses 61 to 63 talk about the surrender to the super soul, which is the more confidential knowledge. 1862 Tamev sharanam gaccha sarvabhaven bharata tat prasadat param shantim sthanam prapyasi shashvatam. O scion of Bharat, surrender unto him utterly. By his grace you will attain transcendental peace and the supreme and eternal abode. So it's interesting that Krishna is now talking about himself in the third person. Right? So generally Krishna is saying, surrender unto me, I will. So it's the first person. But here he is saying that surrender unto him utterly. And the reason is that at this point, Krishna is speaking about Paramatma realization. Right? Now, remember, this is bhakti. So, bhakti can also be directed towards Krishna or expansions of Krishna. So, this is devotion to the Paramatma expansion of Krishna, the kind of devotion that yogis have. But Krishna is also unifying. So while he's making this distinction, because later on Krishna will speak about himself as Swayam Bhagwan, and then he will use the pronoun I. Now he's making that distinction, but he's also saying that there is really no difference, because he says that you will attain transcendental peace by his grace and eternal abode. So this is what Krishna has been promising by himself also. Right? In the 15th chapter, in the verse 19, Krishna had used exactly the same phrase, Sarva Bhavena Bharata. And Sarva Bhavena Bharata means that uh, full in full uh, in all respects or completely. Right? It qualifies Sharanam Gacha, that surrender completely here. Right? So uh, essentially, Krishna is making this point that he and the Paramatma is non-different. Because in 1519, Krishna was speaking more about himself. Right? So, Yomam evam asammodha gyati purushottamam. So sarvavid bhajanti mam sarva bhavena bharata. Right? So while speaking about the more confidential knowledge of surrender to Paramatma, Krishna is also establishing the fact that the Paramatma is non different from him and he is actually the basis of the Paramatma. So Prabhupada quotes another verse from the 15th chapter, this is 15:15, Sarvasya Hridi Sanivishto, that the Lord is seated in everyone's heart. And the recommendation is that one should surrender to the super soul within, which means that one should surrender to the personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada says Krishna has already been accepted by Arjuna as the supreme. He was accepted in the 10th chapter, where Krishna was glorified as Param Brahma, Param Dhama. Okay, let's go to the next verse. Iti te jnanamakhyatam guyat guyataram maya vimrishayete dasheshena yattechhasi tatha kuru. Thus I have explained to you knowledge still more confidential. Deliberate on this fully and then do what you wish to do. So, the more confidential knowledge, two ways to understand. This Acharya gave us two possible ways to understand it. One is that Krishna had initially spoken about the path of karma, sakam karma to nishkam karma to Brahman realization, that he calls as confidential knowledge. Then he took Arjun to the higher path of Paramatma realization, that he calls as more confidential. And he distinguishes it from the knowledge that he will give in the subsequent verses, which essentially are now the conclusion of the Bhagavad-gita, the teachings of Krishna and Bhagavad-gita, which is most confidential. Right? So the knowledge leading up to Brahman realization is confidential, leading up to Paramatma realization is more confidential, and the knowledge leading to Krishna Swayam Bhagwan is most confidential. Another way to understand this also is that uh, because this is representing the near end of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is establishing the Bhagavad Gita at a position higher than the Vedas. So, one way to understand is that the Vedas explain knowledge that is confidential. The Bhagavad Gita, because it extracts the essence of the Vedas, it talks about the the vast expanse of the Vedas summarized succinctly with pro-cons given, the path of karma, jnana, astang, bhakti, all nicely laid out, is more confidential. So essentially, it is establishing the superior position of Bhagavad-gita compared to the Vedic knowledge. The last line is Yatte chhasi tatha kuru. Now you do as you please. And so this is reflecting the fact that Krishna never interferes with the free will of the jiva. Because if he did, there was no need for him to instruct. He would simply do what he wanted, what he wants the jiva to do. But uh, at this point, one may say that if Krishna is supreme, he's all in all, then why doesn't he just make everybody a devotee? And Krishna says, Yat ichhasi tatha kuru. That you act according to what your desires are. And as we know, that the reason Krishna does not interfere in the free will of the jiva, it does not reflect that Krishna's lack of power. It essentially is a reflection on the fact that only out of free will comes love. And because that is the only thing that we have that Krishna does not have, which is our love for him. So if he were to take away our free will, he would also take away our love for him, which is what Krishna is ultimately looking for. So that is why he is giving Arjun the free will to do what he wants. He is giving us the free will also. Another point here is that many times people take this verse out of context. They say, if you say that why are you acting whimsically? And they say, well, Krishna says, Yatichhasi tatha kuru. Like Krishna himself is saying that you do what you wish to do. Right? So this is essentially the classic case of taking an instruction out of context. Right? If Krishna really wanted us to do whatever we want to do, then there was no need for him to speak the Bhagavad-gita. There's no need for him to appear as the scriptures, as guru, as sadhu, because he wants us to act in a certain way. But at the same time, he does not want to interfere with our free will. Next verse. 1864. Sarvaghuya tamam bhuya shunu me paramam vachah ishtosi me dridam iti tato vakshamim te hitam. Because you are my dear, very dear friend, I am speaking to you my supreme instruction, the most confidential knowledge of all. Hear this from me, for it is for your benefit. So now in 3 verses, or rather in 2 verses, because here he's setting the stage, in verses 65 and 66, Krishna is promising to give the most confidential knowledge to Arjuna. So one way of looking at the gradation of knowledge is that confidential knowledge leads to Brahman realization, more confidential realization, more confidential knowledge leads to Paramatma realization, and the most confidential knowledge leads to Bhagwan realization. Another way of looking at it is that the confidential knowledge is derived from the Vedas. The more confidential knowledge is presented in the Bhagavad Gita, and the most confidential knowledge is condensed in the next 2 verses, which presents the essence of the Gita. So, what is the qualification for receiving this most confidential knowledge? Krishna says that because you are my friend, my very dear friend. So, one might say that Arjun is lucky to be Krishna's very dear friend, but I am not. So, does that mean that this most confidential knowledge is not for me? And the answer is no. So, we may not be Krishna's very dear friend, but we can be a very dear friend to Krishna's very dear friend. Or we could be a friend of a friend of a friend of Krishna, which is another way of saying is that if you're connected to Krishna through a bona fide disciplic succession, by transitivity we are Krishna's very dear friend. So we are also qualified to receive, understand, and act upon this most confidential knowledge. Next verse. Next verse.